guys, this is Miss Goki. Today we are working on Lesson 6, the slope of a non-vertical line. Our student outcomes are, students know slope is a number that describes the steepness or slant of a line, and students interpret the unit rate as the slope of a graph. So let's work on the opening exercise together. So we have graph A and graph B, and question A is asking which graph is steeper. So take a look at them, and it's probably obvious that graph A is steeper. B, write directions that explains how to move from one point on the graph to the other for each of graph A and graph B. So let's look at graph A first. There's one point here and one point here. So if we want to start at this point, which is -4, -5, then we want to move up to this point, which is 1, -1. We simply can count our squares. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we move over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we can write this down here. For graph A, we started at -4, -5, and moved 4 units up and 5 units right. And now we can use graph B. So our first point is at the same spot, -4, -5. And our second point is right here, which is 8, -4. So we can do the same thing. We can count our spaces up and our spaces over, and then we can write how we moved. So for graph B, we started at -4, -5, and moved 1 unit up and 12 units right. So now part C says write the directions from part B as ratios and then compare them. And how does this relate to which graph is steeper in part A? So let's write our ratios first. If we're writing graph A as a ratio, we moved 4 units up and 5 units to the right. So graph A, I'm just going to write graph A here. We had 4/5, and for graph B, we get a ratio of 1/12. So if we compare these, 4/5 is greater than 1/12, and then if we look at the graphs, we can tell that graph A is steeper, so we have a bigger ratio for graph A. And since graph B has less steepness, the ratio is smaller. So let's go ahead and move on. So our slope formula is something that we're going to start using, and that is m equals the change in y over the change in x, which in order to find the change in y over the change in x, it's simply taking 2 points on our graph and doing y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So we can take one coordinate point, x2 and y2, and we just subtract it from x1 and y1, and we can get our slope. So another important thing that we want to look at is if our slope is positive or negative. If we have a positive slope, it's going to run this way through the graph. So we can just write positive slope here. And if this is a positive slope, then that means our negative slope is going to run the opposite way through. Like that. Now an easy way to remember the difference between positive and negative is if we draw a mountain, positive slope, we're running up the mountain, where negative slope, we're running down the mountain. So if you're looking at a graph, you can kind of just compare it to a mountain and see, would you want to run up that or run down it? That kind of tells whether or not you should have a positive slope or a negative slope, and you can kind of compare the answer you get after you use the slope formula to see if maybe you made a mistake or not. So let's hit example 2. So we want to choose 2 distinct points on the line and calculate the slope between the points using the slope formula. So when we look at the line, we want to pick a point on the line where it intersects with 2 of our lines from our coordinate grid. So I'm going to pick this point right here, which is 2, 1. And another point that intersects nicely is this point right here, which is 8, 5. So now if we're going to use the slope formula to see what our slope is, we're going to simply write m equals the change in y over the change in x. And this equals y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So now let's use our first point. So if we have y2 minus y1, let's label it. This is x, and we're going to call this x2, and this is y2. And we can label this one x1 and y2. And y1. So now let's take y2, which is 5, and we're going to do 5 minus 1 over x2, which is 8, minus x1, which is 2. 5 minus 1 is 4, and 8 minus 2 is 6. So we have 4/6, which is equivalent to 2/3. So as you can see, the slope is written as 2/3, which is a ratio, or as we saw in 7th grade, the unit rate. So now let's do it how we did in 7th grade. Let's count up 2 and over 3 and see if we end up at 8, 5. So if we start at 2, 1, we count up 1, 2, and over 3. And this lands on a point on our line, so that means that is our slope, because every time we go up 2 and over 3, we should land on a point on our line. So let's go up 2 more and over 3 more, and as you can see, we land on the other point we chose. So we could have chosen to use this point right here, 5, 3, and we still would have gotten the same slope, 2/3. So today we learned that a slope is a number that describes the steepness of a line, and that we can calculate this by using any 2 points on the same line, because we can either just count them over like we did in 7th grade using ratios, or we can now use the slope formula, which right here they have written as m equals p2 minus r2 over p1 minus r1. This is the same thing as saying m equals y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. It's just being seen in a different way. So if you have any questions to ask that you didn't understand, please write them below, and we will talk about them tomorrow in class.